The sound of porcelain meeting wood was sharp enough to make Clara glance up. Margaret Sloane's teacup had tipped slightly, catching on the saucer's rim, but the older woman's hand didn't tremble. Not yet. She steadied the china, her eyes fixed on the pale morning light spilling through the library's high windows, as if it carried an unspoken question she wasn't ready to answer. Clara had been in this house for nearly 3 months, long enough to know its rhythms, the quiet, predictable pattern of Margaret's days, the orderly comings and goings of the household staff, the way Julian Ashford's voice could carry from the study when he was on a call. But today's silence felt different. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a house at rest. It was the kind of stillness that pressed against her ribs, making her notice every creak in the floorboards. She thought again of what Margaret had told her the first week they met, over an evening drink in this same room. How promises made long ago had a way of resurfacing when least expected. At the time, Clara had smiled politely. Now she wondered if that had been more of a warning than a reminiscence. Her reason for being here had always been straightforward: to help Margaret sort through decades of papers, photographs, and ledgers, preparing for the inevitable day when decisions about the estate would need to be made. But the deeper she went into the archives, the more she felt the sharp edges of old disputes, sealed away like brittle letters in a locked drawer. And now, in the shifting air of this winter morning, she sensed that something was about to crack open. The Ashford estate sat on the edge of the Connecticut River, its gray stone walls weathered by more than a century of harsh seasons. Beyond the tall windows, the bare branches of the maples rattled like dry bones. Inside, the scent of old paper and polished wood mingled with the faint aroma of Earl Grey. Margaret closed the leather-bound ledger in front of her and looked at Clara. "It's nearly noon," she said, her voice measured. "Julian will be expecting us in the study." Clara nodded, gathering the notes she had been making, itemized lists of storage boxes, annotations of photographs, and a few questions she wasn't sure she would ever be able to ask outright. Together, they walked down the wide hallway toward the study, their footsteps softened by the Persian runner. Julian was already there, standing behind the heavy mahogany desk. His posture was straight, but his eyes were shadowed, and he seemed to be studying the same piece of paper over and over. On the opposite side of the room, Victor Haldane leaned against the fireplace mantel, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a glass of something amber that caught the light. "Clara?" Julian greeted her with a small nod. "Margaret tells me you've been making good progress with the archives." "I've been trying to keep everything in order," she replied, her gaze flicking briefly toward Victor. His smile was polite, but there was a tightness to it, as though the effort cost him something. Julian gestured for them to sit. "There are matters we need to address, financial ones," he began. "The board will expect a clear accounting before the spring meeting. I want you to focus on records from the last 20 years. Clara made a note. Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing. Victor swirled his drink, breaking the brief silence. "That's a lot of material to sort through in just a few weeks," he remarked. "Mistakes could be made if we rush." Clara met his gaze evenly. "I'll be thorough." The meeting moved on, but under the surface, the air felt taut. Julian outlined the timeline. Margaret quietly agreed to provide access to the locked storage room, and Victor lingered on each point, his questions less about clarity and more about control. Later, in the dim corridor leading back to the library, Margaret paused. "Victor's presence here," she said softly, "has never been without complication." She gave Clara a look that carried weight. "Pay attention to the details no one talks about." That evening, alone in the archives room, Clara followed Margaret's advice. She set aside the neat stacks she had been cataloging and reached for an unlabeled box in the corner. Inside were loose papers, a few family photographs, and a yellowed envelope addressed to Julian's late father. The handwriting was precise, almost formal. She was sliding the letter out when a shadow crossed the doorway. Victor stood there, his voice smooth. "Working late?" She slipped the letter back into the envelope, keeping her movements slow, deliberate, just organizing. He stepped closer, the scent of his cologne faint but distinct. "Some things are better left in the dark, Clara." When he left, she exhaled slowly, her mind already racing. She had been around enough guarded people to know the difference between a warning and a threat. The next morning, she arrived in the library early, determined to get back to that envelope. But when she reached the corner where the box had been, the space was empty. A single sheet of paper lay in its place, folded once. She opened it, her pulse quickening. In neat, unhurried script, it read, "You're not the only one looking." Snow had begun to fall in the early hours, and by mid-morning the grounds of the Ashford estate lay beneath a soft white sheet that muted every sound. Clara stood at the library window, watching flakes drift lazily past the glass, her thoughts caught between the peaceful beauty outside and the unsettling note she'd found the day before. She hadn't told Margaret about it yet, part of her wanted to, but another part needed to understand its meaning first. The memory of Victor's voice lingered in her mind, that deliberate phrasing. Some things are better left in the dark. It was almost a challenge. And though Clara wasn't one to rise to bait, she felt a pull now, a compulsion to find out what exactly was being hidden and why. Margaret's earlier advice to pay attention to what wasn't said had settled deep into her bones. Julian had summoned them to the study again, this time under the pretense of reviewing the household inventory for insurance purposes. The request was ordinary enough, but something in the clipped tone of his message suggested an underlying urgency. Clara gathered her notes, slipped the folded warning into her notebook, and followed the faint sound of voices down the hall. The study was warmer than usual, the fire in the hearth casting flickering light over the dark wood. Julian was at his desk, a ledger open before him, while Margaret sat in the high-backed chair nearest the fire, her hands clasped in her lap. Victor was absent, and Clara couldn't help but notice the subtle relief in the room without him there. "We need to locate certain pieces," Julian said without looking up. "Appraisals will be done before the end of the month, and the insurers are insisting on precise valuations." He finally glanced at her. "I'd like you to focus on the silver collection and the smaller paintings. Those are most at risk of going missing." The pause before those last words felt deliberate. Clara nodded, jotting down the assignment. She sensed Margaret watching her closely, as though weighing whether to speak. But Julian ended the meeting abruptly, his attention returning to the ledger. Later, in the West Wing storage room, Clara began her work. The air smelled faintly of cedar and dust, the dim light from the narrow windows barely illuminating the shelves. As she moved aside a stack of carefully wrapped silver trays, her hand brushed against something unexpected, a small wooden box, its lid secured with an old brass latch. It wasn't heavy, but it had the unmistakable feel of something meant to be kept private. She hesitated. The latch gave way easily, revealing a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon and a single photograph resting on top. The image was of a much younger Margaret standing beside a man Clara didn't recognize, his arm draped casually around her shoulders. On the back, in neat handwriting, was a date: autumn, 1979. The letters were addressed to MS and signed with a name Clara didn't know. She was scanning the first page when a sound behind her made her start. Margaret stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. "I see you found it," Margaret said softly, stepping into the room. Her voice was calm, but her eyes carried an intensity that pinned Clara in place. Those letters were never meant for Julian's eyes, or Victor's. Clara closed the box slowly. "Someone else is looking for them," she said quietly. Margaret's gaze sharpened. "I know, and that's why they must stay here, in your care, until I decide otherwise." She reached out, her hand resting briefly on Clara's arm, a gesture that was both a plea and a warning. They left the storage room together, the wooden box now resting in Clara's satchel. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine tasks, but every so often Clara caught Margaret watching her with the faintest trace of worry. That evening, as she made her way back to her quarters, Clara found an envelope slipped under her door. Inside was a single photograph, the same one she'd seen earlier, but this copy had been torn cleanly down the middle, separating Margaret from the man beside her. Scrawled across the back in black ink were 4 words that sent a chill up her spine. "She's not who you think." Victor Haldane's voice carried down the corridor like a low growl. "Some people don't know their place." The snow had deepened since afternoon, a steady, whispering drift that pressed its hush against the tall panes of the east wing. Antique sconces threw small islands of light along the hallway, leaving pockets of shadow between their amber pools. Clara paused midway to the library, a leather portfolio tucked beneath her arm, and let the words settle where they were meant to land. She did not turn at once. She drew a breath, counted to 3, then faced him. He stood near the library threshold, with the air of a man arriving precisely when he intended to be seen. His suit was darker than the paneled walls, a perfect fit that made the posture look effortless. He adjusted his tie with the measured care of someone tuning an instrument, and gave her the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. Somewhere beyond them, a log in the nearest fireplace cracked, the sound thinning as it traveled, as if the house itself were listening. "I am on my way to return these inventories to Mr. Ashford," Clara said, not raising her voice. "If you would like me to wait outside while you speak with him, I can do that." Victor took a step closer. The scent of his cologne was faint and stern, something resinous that reminded her of polished church pews. "You have been doing more than returning inventories," he said pleasantly. "You have been attending meetings that are none of your concern." She did not move. The corridor framed them the way a narrow stage frames 2 actors who know they cannot leave until the scene has done its work. "Mr. Ashford asked for my observations. I gave them." "Of course he did," Victor replied, as if the phrase tasted agreeable. "Men in grief are susceptible to the appearance of competence. They mistake attention for loyalty. It is not their fault. Grief requires a companion." The words were smooth, and each one was a small blade. Clara kept her gaze steady, even as her heart thumped once, hard enough that she felt it in her throat. Beyond Victor's shoulder, she caught a flicker of motion. Margaret Sloane at the far corner, partly concealed by an arched doorway, the white edge of her cuff visible against dark silk. Margaret's head tilted, the smallest nod, a watchful stillness that asked Clara to choose carefully. "What is it you want, Mr. Haldane?" Clara asked, "to ensure the house remains orderly." He gestured vaguely, an open palm that implied the rugs, the portraits, the 1,000 unspoken rules that held wealth in place. "And to ensure that those who could, by accident or design, unsettle that order understand what it costs to do so." He closed the distance by another pace, not quite in her space, but close enough that the sconce light glossed his cufflinks. "Where were you before this?" he asked softly. "Before the Ashford estate, before the kind attention of Mr. Ashford, before Margaret took you under her sensible wing." It was not a question asked for conversation. It was a key held up to show he owned it. Clara swallowed, tasting metal. She could hear the snow ticking against the window panes like scattered rice at the edge of a church, some ceremony beginning or ending. "I worked," she said, "as I do now." "In a house on the Hudson," Victor murmured. "Before that, a townhouse in Boston that changed hands twice in a year. Before that, a short winter in Albany that ended abruptly. A pattern, Miss Whitmore. A graceful pattern of departure." He lifted his eyes to hers and held them. The Ashford name tolerates many patterns. Some even call it mercy. But mercy, in time, must be curated. Beneath the portfolio, her fingers had begun to ache from holding too tightly. She loosened her grip and willed her breath to its rightful pace. She could feel Margaret's attention like a hand at her back, steadying her spine. "You seem very interested in my past for someone concerned with order in the present," Clara said. "If you have a question about the inventories, I can answer it. If you have a question about me, take it to Mr. Ashford." Victor's smile thinned. "I prefer not to trouble Julian with questions that produce discomfort. He has enough of those, and they tend to become expensive." He shifted his weight, angling so that the light cut his cheekbone into sharper relief. "A word of advice, freely given. Know the difference between usefulness and belonging. Men like Julian are grateful for the first and sentimental about the second, but gratitude fades and sentiment costs money." Snow skittered harder against the glass, as if the wind had turned. Clara pictured Sophie upstairs. Asleep, perhaps, or drifting at the edge of sleep with one small hand flung over a stuffed rabbit, mouth parted, a faint whistle of breath on the exhale. The image steadied her. It reminded her why she had accepted every small indignity that came with this address, because every night the child relaxed against her shoulder and let go of fear. There are orders worth preserving, she thought. They are not the ones carved in wood. "Thank you for the advice," she said. "I will pass along the inventories to Mr. Ashford." Victor did not move aside. His voice lost the satin. "Do not mistake patience for permission," he said, "and do not assume your past is a thing you alone possess. Some of us keep better records than you think." The air in the corridor tightened. For a moment, Clara felt something old and unwelcome rise in her, the reflex to apologize for existing, to fold herself into a smaller shape and pass by with her eyes lowered. It came with a memory of a staircase in a foster home that smelled of fried onions and bleach. The long day when an aunt by marriage had said, without turning her head, that a girl like her should not get used to bedrooms with doors that locked. The memory passed through her like cold, and then receded. She let it go. "Good night, Mr. Haldane," she said. The portfolio under her arm creaked as she shifted it. Victor regarded her for another beat, then, with a shrug graceful enough to be contempt, he stepped aside. His shoes made almost no sound on the runner as he left. Clara exhaled. She stood a moment with her eyes closed, letting the blood recirculate. When she opened them, Margaret was there not in the shadows now, but 5 steps away, her expression composed. "You heard," Clara said. "I heard enough," Margaret replied. She looked down the corridor where Victor had vanished. "He comes from a long line of men who prefer their threats redressed as etiquette." Clara's laugh was a breath. "He knows where I worked before." "Of course he does," Margaret said. "Knowing is his occupation. Using what he knows is his hobby." She reached and adjusted the fold of Clara's scarf, a small maternal motion that told a larger truth. "Do not give him your fear. He feeds on it." Clara nodded. The echo of Victor's cataloging still rang in her head, but each syllable had begun to dull. "Julian asked me to bring these inventories," she said, lifting the portfolio slightly. "I will take them now." Margaret's gaze softened. "Take the east stairs," she said. "He may still be in the study. If not, leave them in the top drawer and lock it. I have the key." They parted at the stairwell. On the landing, a draft found her ankles. The house groaned with the agreeable complaint of old timber in winter. In the study, a lamp burned low. The desk stood tidy, a fountain pen set precisely on a blotter. Julian was not there. She placed the portfolio in the top drawer as asked, turned the small brass key, and slipped it into her pocket with a brief pang that felt like trespass, though it was not. On her way back, she paused in the gallery where portraits of Ashford's past looked down with the confidence of those who never had to ask permission to belong. She studied a young woman in a green dress with a ribbon at her throat. The painter had given her eyes a shiver of light that suggested mischief, or daring, or both. The frame's plaque said 1903. Clara wondered what that girl would have said to Victor Haldane. Back in the corridor, the sconces hummed faintly. The snow's restless tapping softened. She turned the last corner toward the servants' stair and nearly ran into a house footman carrying a tray. He bobbed an apology. His cheeks were flushed from the kitchen heat. All the minor motions of a house at night were in their proper place. A door closing softly, water moving through a pipe somewhere, the ribboned hush that falls when a household agrees to sleep. In her room, she set the lock and leaned against the door, gathering herself. She placed the key on the small table and stood there, listening to the quiet. It was the kind of silence that might forgive you for speaking to it. "I am not afraid of him," she thought. And then, with more honesty, "I am afraid. But I am more tired of being afraid than I am of him." The difference felt like oxygen. She crossed to the dresser to set down her earrings, and saw it at once the pale rectangle at the center of the dark wood, out of place as a snowflake on a stove. The envelope lay without a crease, as if shaped by careful hands. There was no name, no seal, nothing but the linen texture and the faint raised edge where a flap had been pressed shut and then opened. She lifted it. The paper rasped quietly as she slid out the contents. A photograph, grainy, printed on cheap stock. She recognized the gray sweep of the south lawn, the draft horse statue by the hedges, the blurred hem of her own coat. Sophie's small figure walked beside her, mitten in mitten. They were mid-step, heads turned toward each other. The image caught nothing incriminating, only something intimate, the angle of two bodies configured by trust. Her breath shuddered. She turned the photograph over. Nothing written. The room felt narrower. She imagined the path the picture had taken to find her a lens hidden behind a lace curtain. A long lens from a distance, a hand that waited until the corridor was empty, and then delivered what it wanted her to know. "You are watched." The quiet returned with its own statement. "You are not alone." She set the envelope down very carefully, as if it might bruise. That night, Clara finds a plain envelope on her bedroom dresser, with no note, only a grainy photo of her walking Sophie through the garden. Julian Ashford's hand lingered a moment too long on the edge of the desk, as though he could steady the room by touch alone. The study smelled faintly of tobacco and old cedar, its tall shelves lined with first editions and narrow gaps where volumes had been discreetly removed. Outside the window, dawn gathered in a pale band over the frozen lawn, limning the garden statuary in silver. Clara stood near the doorway, clutching the photograph she had found the night before. Her coat was buttoned, as if she were ready to leave, though she had nowhere to go. Julian looked up, the faint lines beside his mouth deepening. "Margaret said you wanted to speak to me early," he said. "You're pale. Sit." She crossed to the leather chair opposite his desk, every step measured, the image of Sophie's mitten in hers burning behind her eyes. She set the photograph face down between them. Julian reached for it without comment, studied the grainy shapes, then turned it over and back again. "This was on my dresser," she said. "No note, no signature." Julian's jaw shifted slightly, as if biting down on a thought. "This house has more eyes than it ought to," he said, "and fewer honest mouths." Her pulse thudded. "It's not just the watching. It's the fact they could walk into my room without me knowing." Julian placed the photograph back on the desk, aligning it with the blotter as if precision might contain the violation. "I'll have the locks changed. And the staff reviewed." His tone softened. "Clara, I'm sorry." She studied his face, wondering how much of his concern was for Sophie, and how much for the estate's reputation. Somewhere, in the rafters of her mind, she heard Victor's voice from the night before, know the difference between usefulness and belonging, and felt the cold truth in it. The study door opened without a knock. Victor stepped in, his expression composed, his coat collar brushed with frost. He glanced at the photograph as if it were an entry on a ledger he had already balanced. "We should discuss the board meeting this afternoon," he said to Julian. Julian did not move the photograph from between them. "We will, later." Victor's gaze flicked to Clara, polite and cutting in equal measure. "Some matters are more urgent than they appear, Miss Whitmore. Best to address them before they grow teeth." Julian's voice sharpened. "And some matters, Victor, require privacy. We'll talk in 20 minutes. Victor's eyes lingered on Clara a fraction too long before he left. The door clicked shut with a precision that felt deliberate. Julian exhaled. "He's been here since before my father died," he said quietly. "Knows where every loose thread is, and he enjoys pulling them." He tapped the photograph. "This is not a random mischief. It's meant to rattle you." Clara folded her hands in her lap to keep them from trembling. "It worked." Julian leaned back. "I can remove him from the estate's internal affairs. It will be messy, and he will make sure it costs me. But if it keeps Sophie safe—" The sound of hurried footsteps in the hall cut him off. Margaret appeared in the doorway, no coat, her hair half pinned as if she had abandoned her dressing table mid-task. "Julian, Clara, you need to come to the South Conservatory, now." Her voice was low but urgent. "It's Sophie." The words fractured the air between them. Clara was on her feet before she registered moving, her chair sliding back against the rug. Julian snatched up the photograph and slipped it into his breast pocket, his expression tightening like a knot pulled taut. They followed Margaret down the corridor, past the muffled ticking of the grandfather clock, into the pale green light of the conservatory where frost traced every pane of glass. Sophie stood near the far window, her small hands pressed to the cold surface, her breath misting the glass. Beside her on the tiled floor was a single stuffed rabbit, the same one Clara had seen in the photograph. The child turned when they entered, her eyes wide and unsettled. "There was a man outside," she said. "He was looking at me." Julian crossed to the window in 3 long strides, scanning the white expanse beyond the hedges. Clara stayed back, her gaze fixed on the rabbit at Sophie's feet. It was dry, clean, untouched, as if it had been placed there by careful hands, not dropped. When Julian turned from the glass, his face was unreadable. "No footprints," he said. "Not a mark in the snow." Clara felt the photograph in her mind again, the exact angle, the trust in Sophie's posture. Whoever had been outside knew where to stand to be seen without leaving a trace. Sophie bent to pick up the rabbit, then hesitated. "It wasn't the gardener," she said softly. "He was wearing a hat like the one in your picture, Clara." The words fell into the silence and stayed there, weighty as ice. The rabbit sat on the kitchen counter like a mute witness, its stitched smile unchanged, its ears bent where Sophie had clutched them. Clara stood at the sink, rinsing her hands under water gone lukewarm, her mind replaying the child's words in a loop. The hat in the photograph. She could still see the grainy outline of the figure in the background, now anchored by Sophie's frightened certainty. Margaret moved around the kitchen with uncharacteristic noise, the clatter of crockery, the heavy closing of cupboards, a deliberate cover for her own unease. Julian entered with his coat still buttoned, phone pressed to his ear. His voice was clipped, businesslike, but the edges frayed with something more personal. Yes, double the perimeter checks, and I want the footage from every exterior camera pulled now. He ended the call and looked at Clara. Nothing on the drives. It's as if he vanished. Clara dried her hands slowly, buying time before speaking. Maybe he didn't vanish. Maybe he was never supposed to be caught on your cameras. Julian's gaze sharpened. You think it's someone inside? I think it's someone who knows the rhythms here better than I do, she replied, glancing toward the hall where Victor had disappeared earlier that morning. Margaret set a mug of coffee in front of Clara. This estate has always been porous, she said carefully. Too many people with too many keys. Julian's phone vibrated against the countertop. He glanced at the screen, then turned it face down without answering. The board meeting is in 2 hours, he said. I need you both to be there. Clara frowned. Why me? Because, he said, if someone thinks they can rattle you into leaving, they should see you standing beside me instead. The statement landed with a mix of reassurance and strategy, leaving Clara to wonder which outweighed the other. Later, in the library, the fire snapped and hissed in the grate. Snowlight pooled on the carpet, catching the faint dust motes stirred by movement. Victor stood near the shelves, hands clasped behind his back, watching Julian sort through a stack of leather-bound ledgers. You're running late for the meeting, Victor remarked, his tone even but his eyes calculating. Julian didn't look up. We'll be there. I had other matters to attend to. Victor's gaze shifted to Clara, who sat at the far table with the rabbit resting beside a notepad. Ah, he said, the governess joins the strategy sessions now. Clara kept her expression neutral. I look after Sophie. That makes me invested in what happens here. Victor smiled faintly. Invested, that's one way to put it. Julian closed the ledger with deliberate finality. We leave in 10 minutes. The meeting room in town was warm, but smelled faintly of damp wood, as if the old floorboards absorbed the winter air too easily. A long, polished table divided the room, flanked by high-backed chairs that creaked under shifting weight. Board members murmured in low tones until Julian entered, Clara just behind him, Victor bringing up the rear. The first half of the meeting was all numbers and projections, voices droning over quarterly reports. Clara's focus wavered until emotion passed around a folder of estate maintenance contracts. A familiar name leapt out at her, not the gardener, not staff, but a private security subcontractor. And beside it, a signature she had seen before, in blue ink on an envelope tucked behind that photograph. She looked up sharply. Victor was watching her from across the table, the faintest curve at the corner of his mouth. Her fingers tightened on the folder. Julian, she said quietly, but the weight in her voice carried. Who authorized this? The room stilled. Julian leaned to see, his expression darkening. This contract isn't supposed to be active. Victor's voice broke the silence. Some things require discretion. You'd be amazed what can be kept quiet if you know the right people. Julian's hand flattened on the table. Discretion is not a license to put my family at risk. Victor met his gaze without flinching. Family, he said slowly, is a flexible term in this house. The words lingered like smoke as Julian closed the folder, signaling the meeting's abrupt end. He rose, and so did Clara, the rabbit under her arm. Outside, the late afternoon light was thin, the street quiet except for the slow crunch of their steps toward the waiting car. As Julian opened the door for her, Clara hesitated, glancing back at the second-floor windows of the meeting hall. A shadow moved there, quick and deliberate, before the curtain fell back into place. In the end, the weight of the estate was never in the bricks, the portraits, or the acreage. It was in the people who had lived inside its walls and the choices they had made. Clara could feel that truth in the silence after Victor's final absence, in the way Julian no longer spoke with the same guarded cadence, and in Sophie's laughter returning to the halls as if some invisible cord had been cut. The rooms themselves seemed lighter, as though dust that had settled for decades had finally been disturbed. But resolution did not come with the sweetness of a perfect ending. The truth had left its marks on Julian, whose trust now bore visible seams, on Clara, whose understanding of loyalty had been both deepened and sharpened, and on the wider circle of the estate, where whispered alliances had shifted in the wake of exposure. Forgiveness was not a single gesture, but a series of decisions, each one a conscious choice to value the bond over the wound. Some days it came easily, other days it had to be fought for like breath. Julian's willingness to protect Sophie had been unquestionable, but his willingness to confront the fractures in his own history was what allowed them to heal. He learned to speak of his father without filtering every memory through pride. He learned to listen to the parts of Clara's story that were uncomfortable, acknowledging the pain rather than smoothing over it. In turn, Clara began to see him less as a man trapped by his inheritance, and more as someone capable of reshaping it. The legacy they faced was no longer just about property lines and boardroom decisions. It was about the moral ground they were willing to stand on together. They had learned that silence was never neutral. A closed mouth in the face of wrongdoing only handed the future to those willing to speak louder. The cost of truth had been high, it always is, but it had bought them the chance to define their family on their own terms, not in the shadow of someone else's mistakes. Margaret, too, found her place in this recalibrated order. Her quiet diligence, once taken for granted, was now recognized as the scaffolding that had kept so much from collapsing. Sophie, though too young to grasp the full shape of events, absorbed the changes in her own way. She saw her home become a place where trust could be spoken aloud, where questions were not punished, and where the rabbit on her pillow was just a toy, not a silent threat. The act of facing the truth had not only uncovered what was hidden, but had altered the contours of the relationships that remained. Victor's absence left a void, but it was a space in which honesty could grow. No one pretended it would be easy. The habits of self-protection and the allure of denial were always near, ready to tempt them back into patterns they had fought to break. But the difference now was that they recognized the cost of that retreat, and they were unwilling to pay it. Clara often found herself walking the garden paths at dusk, tracing the same loops she had made when she first arrived, though now the air felt different. She no longer scanned every shadow for danger, but she also no longer ignored them. She understood that light was not the absence of dark, but its counterbalance. Julian would join her sometimes, their conversations meandering from estate matters to Sophie's latest mischief, to memories that were neither bitter nor sweet, but simply part of the fabric. The philosophy remains. Legacy is not what you leave behind in objects or titles, but in the courage you pass forward. What began as an intrusion had become a reckoning, and what began as a reckoning had become a choice. They had chosen to confront the cost of truth, to forgive where forgiveness was possible, and to accept that redemption was not a gift given, but a path walked. The estate stood as it always had, but its foundation now included something stronger than stone, an unspoken vow to guard not just the property, but the integrity of the family who called it home. If you like the story, then leave it number 1 in the comments, and make sure you subscribe to our channel to hear the next story.